Her perfectly coiffed hair flew back as she hit the water, a single high-pitched shriek echoing through the otherwise silent night. I'd warned her so many times. Now, all that was left was the low hum of the fence and the glow of my freshly chlorinated pool. I guess she finally got her shock. The first note had been polite, almost neighborly. "Dear Mr. Caldwell," it began, tucked neatly under the doormat, "it has come to my attention that the pH level of your swimming pool appears to be imbalanced. For the health and safety of our community, please address this matter at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, Margaret Sterling, HOA President." Leo Caldwell, a man whose patience was as thin as the razor wire he was considering for his fence, had read the note and scoffed. "Margaret Sterling, HOA President," he'd muttered to his dog Buster, a shaggy golden retriever who had a penchant for napping by the pool and a deep distrust of anyone in a crisp pantsuit. More like the grand overseer of other people's business. The pool, a pristine turquoise oasis, was Leo's pride and joy. It was the only reason he'd bought this house in the first place, a small slice of paradise in the suburbs, a place to escape the relentless grind of his job as an electrical engineer. He spent hours meticulously maintaining it, balancing the chemicals, skimming the surface, and ensuring the water was always at the perfect temperature. Margaret, on the other hand, was the kind of person who saw a private pool and felt a civic duty to regulate it. Her house was 3 doors down, a fortress of beige stucco and manicured hedges, and it seemed her primary pastime was peering over her fence, a pair of binoculars clutched in her hand. She was a woman who saw the world in rules and regulations, and Leo's pool, with its shimmering, unregulated glory, was an affront to her very existence. The notes had escalated quickly. The second one, a week later, was printed on a formal letterhead, complete with the HOA's logo. It detailed a suspected violation of Section 7.4, Subsection C of the Homeowners Association bylaws, which, according to Margaret, prohibited unauthorized aquatic activities, including but not limited to the use of private swimming facilities for communal gatherings without proper chemical testing and approval. Leo had a brief, paranoid moment where he wondered if his one-man float party the previous Saturday constituted a communal gathering. He'd decided to ignore it, a decision that proved to be a grave mistake. Margaret's tactics became bolder. The next week, he found her in his backyard, a small vial of water from his pool clutched in her hand. She was crouched by the edge, a pH testing kit laid out on the concrete, a look of clinical determination on her face. "Mrs. Sterling, what in the hell are you doing?" Leo had demanded, his voice a low growl. She hadn't even flinched. "I'm conducting a routine inspection, Mr. Caldwell. Your pool water has a faint green tint. It suggests an imbalance of algae-killing agents." "It's the reflection from the trees," Leo had said, his hands clenched into fists. "And this is my backyard. You can't just waltz in here. The HOA bylaws state that we have the right to inspect properties for compliance," she'd said, her tone as dry as a lecture. "Your property is a liability to the community." Leo had walked her to the gate, a silent, seething presence. "Do not ever come into my yard again," he'd warned. "Or I will call the police." Margaret had smiled, a thin, patronizing curve of her lips. "Duly noted, Mr. Caldwell, but the health and safety of our community is my priority." The next morning, his pool was a cloudy, milky white. A thick layer of something, soap maybe, or some kind of chemical, coated the surface. It took him 2 days and an emergency trip to the pool supply store to restore the water to its former glory. He knew it was her. He didn't have proof, but the cold, hard certainty of it was a lead weight in his stomach. He'd considered calling the police, but without evidence it would be his word against hers. And Margaret Sterling, HOA President, had a way of making herself sound eminently reasonable and trustworthy. The final straw came a few nights later. Leo was working late in his garage, soldering a circuit board for a new project, when he heard a faint splash. He froze, his head snapping up. The sound was unmistakable. He turned off the soldering iron and crept to the window, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Through the glass, he saw a figure, a silhouette of a woman, climbing out of his pool. She was wearing a black one-piece bathing suit and a floral swim cap. As she reached the concrete, she took off the cap, and the pale moonlight illuminated a familiar, severe face. It was Margaret. She was dripping wet, her arms and legs covered in what looked like small red welts. She was muttering to herself, her voice a low, furious hiss. "The chlorine? It's too high. The bylaws clearly state excessive chemical levels." She picked up a small vial and dipped it into the water, a testing strip already in her hand. She held it up to the moon, shaking her head in disgust. Leo watched, a silent, simmering rage building inside him. He had spent hours working on that pool. He had installed a state-of-the-art pump and filtration system, a new heater, and a custom lighting setup. He'd even installed a new electric fence along the back property line to keep out raccoons and other wildlife. It was a subtle fence, a low voltage, more of a deterrent than a true barrier, a project he had been working on for a few weeks, connected to a sensor that only activated when something brushed against it. He'd told no one about it. He watched her, a woman who felt so entitled to his property that she would trespass in the middle of the night to inspect it. The thought of her judgmental gaze, her endless notes, her sabotage, all culminating in this final brazen act, pushed him past the brink. A cold, calculated calm settled over him. His mind, trained in the elegant logic of electrical engineering, began to work. He moved away from the window, his bare feet silent on the wood floor. He walked to the breaker box, a quiet purpose in his steps. He looked at the switch he had labeled pool fence. He had designed it to have a fail-safe, a low-level static charge that would only activate when the sensor was tripped. But he was an electrical engineer, and a few small adjustments to the circuit could change that. He moved to his desk, grabbed a small portable transformer, and walked back to the breaker box. He connected the transformer, flipping a few hidden switches he had installed as a safeguard, bypassing the low-voltage limit. A low hum filled the air. He walked back to the window, peering out at the scene. Margaret was now standing at the very edge of the concrete, her back to him, staring into the water. The moonlight caught the white blonde of her hair. She was muttering again, something about a pH violation. The low-voltage fence was a few feet away from her. All she had to do was touch it, just one little tap. As if on cue, a sudden gust of wind caught a leaf, sending it skittering across the concrete. Margaret, startled, took a step back, her hand flying out to catch her balance. Her fingers, still dripping with pool water, brushed against the fence. The hum in the air intensified, a low, ominous buzz. Her eyes went wide, a look of pure, unadulterated shock on her face. Her perfectly coiffed hair flew back as she hit the water, a single high-pitched shriek echoing through the otherwise silent night. The sound was pure music to Leo's ears. The water splashed, a violent eruption of turquoise against the dark concrete. Margaret surfaced, sputtering, a frantic, wild look in her eyes. The fence was silent again. The transformer had done its job, delivering one powerful, controlled jolt, a single act of karmic justice. She was no longer a smug, self-righteous HOA president. She was just a woman, gasping for air, her carefully constructed world shattered by a single, shocking splash. Leo watched, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. She finally got her shock. But the real question, the one that lingered in the still, humid air, was what she would do next. He had a feeling this was only the beginning. This user is requesting part 2 of the story titled, "I was done with HOA, Karen sneaking into my pool. So I shocked her, literally." The story should continue the narrative from where part 1 left off. Maintaining the specified tone and style, the user has previously requested a powerful 6-second hook, part 1 of a 10-part dramatic story. Each part should be 1,500 words, third-person narrative, fast-paced with realistic dialogue, strong character conflict, emotional stakes, and escalating tension. The story must unfold organically from the title. Every part must end with a powerful beat. Justice, karma, shock, irony, or a major turning point. No summaries or explanations. Maintain cinematic storytelling, vivid descriptions, and compelling emotional drama. I need to write part 2 following these instructions. The last part ended with Margaret being shocked by the fence and falling into the pool. Part 2 should pick up immediately after this event, dealing with the aftermath of her fall and Leo's reaction. The tension should escalate, and the conflict between Leo and Margaret should deepen. The ending of Part 2 should also be a powerful beat. My plan. Start immediately after the last scene. Margaret is in the pool, sputtering and in shock. Leo is watching her from his window. Margaret's reaction. She will be furious, but also a bit rattled. She will immediately assume Leo did this on purpose. Her internal thoughts will be a mix of outrage and a need for revenge. Leo's reaction. Leo's initial satisfaction will be quickly replaced by anxiety and a dawning realization of the potential consequences of his actions. He'll have to decide what to do. Does he confront her? Does he pretend to know nothing? The confrontation. Margaret will get out of the pool and confront Leo, likely pounding on his door. The dialogue between them will be a key part of this section, filled with accusations and denials. Margaret will threaten legal action and HOA sanctions. Leo will have to navigate this carefully, the twist, or escalation. Margaret, being the HOA president, has more power than just a lawsuit. She might use the HOA's authority to escalate the situation in a more personal and immediate way, perhaps cutting off his water or electricity under some flimsy bylaw, or reporting him to a different authority, like the city for a pool-related violation. This will put Leo on the defensive and raise the stakes. The ending beat. The ending of Part 2 needs to be a significant turning point. Maybe Margaret's threats turn out to be more serious than Leo first thought. Perhaps she uses a hidden power of the HOA, or she reveals a personal connection to a figure of authority. The ending should leave Leo in a new, more precarious position than he was at the start of the part, with a new, immediate problem to solve, not just the long-term threat of a lawsuit. A good ending would be Margaret leaving, but then Leo finds a new, official notice from the HOA taped to his door. A notice that seems minor but has a sinister undertone and immediate consequences that he can't ignore. This will put the ball back in his court and force him to act again. Word count check. I will need to ensure the scene is detailed and the dialogue is robust to reach the 1,500-word target, focusing on the emotional and psychological conflict between the two characters. The pacing should remain fast, but the tension should come from the dialogue and the high stakes of their conflict, rather than just physical action. Part 2. The aftermath. The splash was a sharp final period on the night's sentence. For a long, silent moment, the only sound was the frantic thrashing of Margaret Sterling, her head bobbing in the chlorinated water. Leo watched her from the darkness of his living room, a grim satisfaction curling in his gut. The smug, self-righteous aura she carried, the one that had manifested in passive-aggressive notes and veiled threats, was gone. All that remained was raw panic and a desperate struggle to regain her footing. She finally found the steps, pulling herself out of the pool with a gasping heave. Her meticulously styled hair, so often a beacon of suburban superiority, was plastered to her face in dripping clumps. The black one-piece bathing suit clung to her pale, shivering skin. She looked less like a fearsome HOA president and more like a drowned rat. You did this?" she spat, her voice a shaky whisper. She turned toward the dark shadow of his house, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and disbelief. "I know you did." Leo remained motionless, his hand still on the breaker box. He felt the cold, hard weight of his actions settle in his stomach. He had done it. He hadn't meant to, not really, but the temptation had been too great. The little transformer, the bypass of the low-voltage limit, it had been an impulse, a moment of pure, unchecked rage. But now, as he watched her on the other side of his window, shivering and dripping, a faint tremor ran through him. What if she'd been hurt? What if she'd hit her head on the concrete? He hadn't thought that far ahead. His moment of grim satisfaction evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling anxiety. He heard the click of her heels on the concrete as she stalked toward his back door, a new, more dangerous kind of fury building in her. The pounding on the door was a violent, insistent rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. Leo, I know you're in there. Her voice was a shriek, raw and thin. Open this door! You are in so much trouble, do you hear me? So much trouble. Leo walked to the door, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to be calm. He had to be collected. He slid the deadbolt back and pulled the door open just a crack. She was standing on his porch, water puddling at her feet. Her face was a mask of furious indignation, her eyes narrowed to slits. Don't you dare pretend you don't know what happened. Margaret, Leo said, his voice a steady, low baritone. It's 3 a.m, and you're soaking wet. Are you okay? The question seemed to enrage her more than any accusation could. Don't you patronize me. You electrocuted me. You installed some kind of electrified death trap on your fence, and you did it on purpose. Margaret, I have no idea what you're talking about, Leo said, leaning against the doorframe, trying to look as nonchalant as possible. I was in the middle of a project and I heard a splash. I came to the window and saw you in my pool. Did you fall in? I was conducting an inspection. She spat, her hands clenched into fists. Your water is a public health hazard. It's over-chlorinated. And as I was leaving, your fence... Your fence. It zapped me. It threw me right into the water. My fence is for keeping out raccoons, Leo said, a hint of steel in his voice. And you were on my property without my permission in the middle of the night. That's called trespassing, Margaret. And I'm pretty sure that's against the bylaws. She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Trespassing? I am the HOA president. I have the authority to ensure all properties are compliant. What you did was a deliberate act of assault with a deadly weapon. A deadly weapon? Leo scoffed. It's a low-voltage fence. It's a deterrent. You must have startled yourself and lost your footing. Don't you lie to me. Her voice was a low growl. I felt it. A current, strong enough to throw me back. And you're an electrical engineer, aren't you? This was no accident. Leo felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. He was right. She was going to see this through. His heart raced. What would she do? Go to the police? The HOA? I have witnesses, she said, and a new, chilling calmness entered her voice. My neighbor, Miss Patterson, saw you from her window. She saw you at your breaker box, a moment before I went down. You're not just dealing with the HOA anymore, Mr. Caldwell. You're dealing with the law. A knot of dread tightened in Leo's stomach. He didn't know if Ms. Patterson had actually seen anything, or if it was a bluff. But Margaret Sterling wasn't a woman who bluffed often. What do you want? He asked, his bravado gone. I want justice, she said, her voice dripping with venom. And I want that illegal, dangerous contraption removed from your property by noon tomorrow. If it isn't, I will file a police report for assault and battery, and I will report you to the city code enforcement for a safety violation. She paused, a glint of cruel triumph in her eyes. And effective immediately, as per Article 5, Section B of our community bylaws, due to your property's repeated and willful disregard for safety regulations, I am placing a temporary suspension on your home's main power. It will be reconnected once the safety violation is resolved. Leo's mind reeled. A temporary suspension on his power? He hadn't even known that was a thing the HOA could do. It sounded ludicrous, but with Margaret at the helm, he knew it was a real threat. You can't do that, he said, the words a desperate plea. That's illegal. The bylaws give the board authority in cases of immediate danger to the community, she said, pulling a laminated card from the pocket of her soaking wet robe. The card had the HOA logo and a list of her official powers. I've already submitted the emergency notice to the utility company. The power will be shut off in a few hours. Good luck, Mr. Caldwell. I hope you enjoy the dark. She turned on her heel and began to walk away, a dark, dripping silhouette retreating into the night. Leo stood there, the door ajar, the warm air from his house mingling with the cool night breeze. The humming of his fridge, the low whisper of his air conditioner, the faint glow of the lights in his living room. They were all about to go dark. He closed the door, his hand shaking. He looked at the window, at the shimmering blue water of his pool, the source of all his joy and now, all his trouble. He had won the battle tonight, but Margaret had just declared war, and the silence after Margaret's retreat was a tangible thing, heavy and foreboding. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the gentle thrum of the pool pump, and the soft, ambient glow of the living room lights were now all Leo could hear. and they sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. He stood in the middle of his living room, the weight of Margaret's threat settling over him like a suffocating blanket. "A temporary suspension on your home's main power." The words echoed in his head, a cold, hard fact he couldn't process. He went to the window, peering out into the still night. The street was dark and quiet, the only movement the slight rustle of leaves in the breeze. 3 doors down, Margaret's house was a fortress of darkness, a single light on in what he knew was her home office, a beacon of her relentless, bureaucratic energy. She was probably in there right now, finalizing the paperwork, savoring her victory. A wave of panic, hot and nauseating, washed over him. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand here and wait for his life to be plunged into darkness. He was an electrical engineer. He built systems. He solved problems. And Margaret Sterling was a problem. He grabbed his laptop, his mind racing. He had to find the bylaws. He'd signed a stack of papers when he bought the house, a formality he hadn't thought twice about. Now the details were a matter of life and death, or at least of electricity. He found the digital copy of the HOA covenants and bylaws in a cloud folder and started scrolling, his eyes flying over the dense legal jargon. Article 5, Section B, Article 5, Section B. There it was. He clicked on it, his heart pounding. Article 5, Section B, Emergency Board Powers. In the event that a property owner's actions or inactions pose an immediate and serious threat to the health, safety, or welfare of the community, the HOA board, with a majority vote, may take immediate action to mitigate the threat, including but not limited to the temporary suspension of utility services to the property in question. Leo's stomach churned. The bylaw existed, but a majority vote? Margaret had claimed she had already submitted the notice to the utility company. Had she gotten a vote in the middle of the night? It seemed impossible. She was a known autocrat, but even she couldn't pull that off. Unless she had somehow convinced the other 2 board members to give her blanket authority in emergency situations. Or maybe they were just apathetic and signed off on anything she put in front of them. He knew who the other 2 board members were. A retired accountant named Arthur, who was perpetually on vacation, and a young mother named Chloe, who was too busy with 3 kids to care about anything but the neighborhood playground. It was entirely plausible that Margaret had their signatures on a form that gave her this power. Leo's eyes scanned the document again. There was no mention of a witness. That had been a bluff, a theatrical lie to add weight to her threats. But the power shut down. That felt real. The sheer audacity of it, the cold, methodical cruelty, was exactly the kind of thing Margaret would do. He had to get ahead of it. He needed a plan. He was an engineer. He could build something. Something to bypass the power shutoff? No, that was insane. It would be illegal, a true violation. He had to play by the rules, as frustrating as they were. But he could exploit the rules. He just had to find the loophole. His phone buzzed. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it and a picture popped up. It was a photo of a small, official-looking notice taped to his front door. The HOA logo was at the top, and in bold black letters it read, "Final Notice of Violation." Below that, the text, "Violation, Article 7, Section C, Unregistered Electrical Modifications. The resident has installed an unpermitted high-voltage electrical device on their property, creating a public safety hazard. Failure to remove this device by 12 p.m. tomorrow will result in immediate and permanent suspension of utility services per Article 5, Section B." The photo wasn't a bluff. She had actually done it. Leo's heart pounded with a mix of fury and fear. She was so fast, so efficient. She hadn't wasted a second. The notice was already on his door, a public declaration of his perceived guilt. He had to get out of the house. He had to do something physical, something that wasn't staring at a computer screen. He grabbed a flashlight and slipped out his back door, heading for the source of all his troubles, the fence. The fence was a simple chain-link barrier he'd put up to keep Buster from wandering too far. He'd added the low-voltage wire as a deterrent for raccoons, not people. He ran his hand along the wire, a faint metallic taste on his tongue. It was a simple circuit, a small transformer tucked away behind a bush. He pulled back the foliage and looked at it, his fingers tracing the wires he had spliced just hours ago. He had to dismantle it. He had to remove the unregistered electrical modification and make this all go away. He reached for the wire cutters he had in his back pocket. But as he did, he heard a sound, a quiet rustle from the shadows of his neighbor's yard. He froze, his head snapping up. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was Ms. Patterson, the elderly woman who lived next door, her face a pale, ghostly oval in the dim moonlight. She was holding a small camera, the red light on the back blinking. "Mr. Caldwell?" she said, her voice a reedy whisper. I saw what happened. Leo's blood ran cold. Margaret hadn't been bluffing. Miss Patterson had seen him. But what had she seen? Had she seen him at the breaker box? Or had she just seen Margaret fall? "I'm sorry," he stammered. "It was an accident." "I didn't mean to." "I know what you did," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I recorded it." "All of it." She held up the camera, the red light a tiny, malevolent eye. "I saw her come into your yard, and I saw her fall." "But I also saw you—" "At the breaker box. I saw you make the changes." "She's right, Leo. You did it on purpose." Leo felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The last of his defenses crumbled. He had been so sure he could deny it that it would be his word against hers. But now, with a witness and a recording, "I'm going to have to give this to the police," she said, her voice filled with a painful sense of duty. "I can't let this go. It's a matter of public safety." Leo stared at her, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. His quick act of revenge, his moment of furious satisfaction, had just turned into a recorded, premeditated crime. He was no longer just an angry homeowner. He was a suspect. As he watched her retreat back into her house, her small form disappearing into the shadows, a new, more powerful feeling began to burn inside him. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a cold, hard resolve. He had been pushed too far. She had gone too far. He wasn't just defending his pool anymore. He was fighting for his freedom, and he was going to win. quickly replaced by a furious surge of understanding. Margaret hadn't gone to the police. She had just threatened to. The witness was a tool, a new, more effective weapon to use against him. Ms. Patterson hadn't filed a police report. She had given her testimony directly to Margaret. The police were a bluff. The real battle was still with the HOA. He turned away from Ms. Patterson's door, a new cold clarity settling in his mind. Margaret had outmaneuvered him at every turn. She had cut off his power, not with a legal writ, but with a bluff. And now she was using a well-meaning but naive neighbor to back up her claims. The real danger wasn't jail time. It was the slow, methodical dismantling of his life, piece by piece, by the HOA. He walked back to his house, the sun now beating down on him. The silence inside was oppressive. He had no power, and he had a growing, visceral need for revenge. He realized he had been playing by her rules, reacting to her moves. He had to change the game. He couldn't fight a bureaucrat with his bare hands. He had to use the one thing she didn't have: creativity. He sat down at his kitchen table and pulled out a notepad. He started scribbling, drawing diagrams, making lists. He was an electrical engineer. He understood systems. Margaret's system was the HOA, a rigid, inflexible structure of rules and regulations. It had a chain of command, a weakness. Her power came from the other two board members, Arthur and Chloe. If he could find a way to discredit Margaret in their eyes, to expose her for the fraud she was, he could cut off her power at the source. The problem was, he knew nothing about them. He needed intelligence. He needed to know their weaknesses, their triggers. He decided to start with Chloe, the young mother. He had seen her at the neighborhood playground, a tired-looking woman with a perpetually harried expression. Her life revolved around her kids, and the playground was her kingdom. Leo walked to the park, the scorching sun a relentless weight on his shoulders. He found Chloe there, pushing a toddler on a swing, her face flushed with heat. "Chloe," Leo asked, his voice soft. She looked up, startled. "Leo, what are you doing here?" "I thought you were in some kind of trouble." "I am," he said, letting the vulnerability show. "Margaret shut my power off. Over my pool fence." Chloe's expression softened slightly. "I know. She sent an emergency notice to us last night. She said you had a high-voltage device and it was a public hazard." "It's a low-voltage fence for raccoons," Leo said, meeting her eyes. "She was on my property in the middle of the night taking a water sample and she stumbled. She's weaponizing the HOA against me. She's a bully, Chloe, and she's out of control." Chloe looked away, her face troubled. "I don't know, Leo. The notice said you were a danger to the community. We had to act. It was an emergency. Did you see it? The danger?" Leo pressed. "Or did you just take her word for it?" "She's a zealot. She's obsessed with my pool. She's been in my backyard. She's sabotaged my water. I can prove it." A flicker of doubt passed across Chloe's face. I have so much going on." "I trusted her judgment. You shouldn't," Leo said, his voice gaining a desperate urgency. He glanced at the playground, at the children running and screaming. An idea, half-formed and dangerous, began to take shape in his mind. You shouldn't trust her with anything, especially not the safety of the kids in this community. Chloe looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" Leo leaned in, his voice a low whisper. "Your new playground. Who approved it? Who signed off on the safety inspection? The HOA, which means—" "Margaret," the words hit Chloe like a physical blow. The look on her face was a mix of shock and dawning horror. She had a new fear, a new vulnerability that Leo could exploit. He had found a crack in Margaret's carefully constructed facade. The sun beat down, and the silence from his dark house was a constant presence. He had planted a seed of doubt, a single potent charge in Margaret's perfect system. He had gone from a victim to a saboteur. The game had changed. And as Chloe looked at her children with a newfound anxiety, Leo knew that he had just hit her where it hurt the most. In the quiet suburbs, a ticking time bomb waited. It wasn't a bomb of dynamite or wires, but of shattered metal and broken trust. Every night they came, and every night they left my mailbox in pieces. So I built something they couldn't touch. But what I built wasn't just a fortress. It was a tomb. And I didn't realize until it was too late that I had trapped myself inside. The mailbox was a sentinel on a small hill, a humble monument to suburban life. Or it had been. Now it was a testament to suburban warfare. Its aluminum body was a collage of dents and scratches, its red flag a limp, broken wing. For the third time this month, Mark stood in his driveway, a bucket of tools at his feet, and a deep, simmering anger in his gut. The sun was a soft, pale thing trying to warm the crisp morning air, but all Mark felt was the cold dread of inevitability. They were the HOCOPs, a self-appointed militia of the local homeowners association. Their leader was a man named Richard, a retired police officer who had traded his badge for a clipboard and a golf cart. Richard believed that Mark's house, with its slightly overgrown lawn and a rogue garden gnome, was a blight on the neighborhood's pristine landscape. The mailbox, Richard had declared with the self-righteousness of a zealot, was an unsightly obstruction and a violation of community standards. Mark had tried to reason with him. He had pointed out the mailbox was a standard size and color, that it was the same model as a dozen others in the neighborhood. Richard had smiled, a thin, patronizing curl of his lips, and informed Mark that standards were subject to interpretation. "It's about the aesthetic, Mark," Richard had said, his voice as smooth and cold as Riverstone. "It's about the feel of the neighborhood. And frankly, your mailbox gives off the wrong feel. The first time, they had just knocked it off its post. The second time, they had hit it with their golf cart, leaving a long, ugly gash down its side. This time, they had used something heavier. The post was snapped in half, and the mailbox itself was a crumpled, unrecognizable piece of junk." "Dad?" A small voice cut through the fog of Mark's rage. His son Leo stood in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes wide. He was 7, and the world was supposed to be a safe place. Mark's hands clenched into fists. He couldn't let his son see him like this. He forced a smile, a brittle, unconvincing thing. "Just a little maintenance, buddy," Mark said, his voice gruff. "Mailbox is a bit wobbly." Leo didn't buy it. He walked over to the wreck of a mailbox, his small fingers tracing the deepest dent. "Did the bad guys do this again?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mark's forced smile crumbled. He picked up the mangled box, the cold aluminum like an accusation in his hands. "Yes, Leo, they did." That was the turning point. The casual vandalism had become an act of intimidation. This wasn't about a mailbox anymore. It was about control. Mark's neighbor, Sarah, a kind woman who had lived on the street for 20 years, was watching from her porch, her face a mask of silent sympathy. She had a new mailbox, a gleaming black one, untouched. She had been one of the first to comply with Richard's demands. Mark had heard the rumors that the HOA cops were even making people repaint their homes. Mark had always been a quiet man, a software engineer who valued logic and order. He preferred to solve problems with reason and code, not conflict. But Richard's crew wasn't interested in logic. They were interested in power. The HOA had become a miniature police state, and Mark had been marked as a non-compliant citizen. That night, after Leo was asleep, Mark sat at his kitchen table, a half-empty mug of coffee in front of him. He had spent the last 2 hours on his laptop, a whirlwind of frustrated research. He had looked up ordinances, legal precedents, and even consulted a forum for people dealing with abusive HOAs. The consensus was grim. Richard had the support of the board and the majority of the neighborhood's apathetic residents. There was no legal recourse short of a long, expensive lawsuit that would drain Mark's savings and likely end with him being forced to sell his home. As he closed his laptop, a thought struck him. Richard had said the mailbox was an unsightly obstruction. An obstruction. Richard's logic was an inversion of reality. The mailbox was the victim, not the obstruction. The HOCOPs were the real obstruction. They were an obstruction to peace, to freedom, to common decency. A cold, clear resolve settled over Mark. He would not give in. He would not be intimidated. He would not let his son grow up thinking that bullies always won. He would build a new mailbox, but it would be different this time. It would not be an unsightly obstruction. It would be a fortress. The next morning, Mark drove to a local welding shop. He had a few blueprints scribbled on a napkin, and the owner, a grizzled man named Frank, raised a skeptical eyebrow. "You want a mailbox made of what, son?" Frank asked, peering at the crude drawing. Reinforced steel, Mark said, his voice steady, with a concrete base. And I want the post anchored 4 feet deep, Frank chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. Sounds more like a bunker than a mailbox. You expecting a war? Something like that, Mark said, his eyes meeting Frank's. I want it to be unbreakable. I want it to be a statement. Frank's grin widened. I like your style, kid. Give me a week. It's gonna be ugly, but it'll be a tank. It was an understatement. When Mark returned a week later, Frank had a masterpiece of brutalist architecture waiting for him. The mailbox was a thick black rectangle of welded steel, its corners sharp and unforgiving. The post was a heavy I-beam and the base was a monstrous block of concrete. It looked less like a mailbox and more like a miniature fortress, a defiant monolith in the face of suburban conformity. Mark had it installed on a Friday afternoon. He had rented a small backhoe and did the work himself, digging a massive hole and pouring the concrete foundation. The neighbors, including Richard, watched from their windows, their curiosity a palpable thing. Richard, in particular, looked on with a kind of disdainful curiosity, as if he were watching a bug squirm. He didn't come out to confront Mark. He just watched, a silent observer of a silent challenge. When it was finished, the mailbox stood tall and proud, a dark, gleaming sentinel against the backdrop of Mark's green lawn. It was an aesthetic nightmare. It was a violation of every unwritten rule of the neighborhood. It was beautiful. That night, Mark sat on his porch, a beer in his hand, waiting. The air was cool and still. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows. He felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. He had thrown down the gauntlet. He had made a stand. At 2 a.m., he heard the faint hum of an electric motor. The golf cart. He saw the dim headlights approaching, 2 figures outlined in the darkness. Richard and his lieutenant, a beefy man named Greg, who was fond of wearing a fanny pack and a self-important scowl. They stopped a few yards from the mailbox. They got out of the cart, and Mark heard the heavy thud of something being placed on the ground. A baseball bat. Richard held the bat, a faint smile on his face. He looked like a man about to enjoy a pleasant, simple task. He raised the bat, a dark silhouette against the streetlights, and swung. The sound wasn't the expected crack of aluminum and plastic. It was a dull, metallic clang, a resonant, deep thud that echoed through the quiet street. Richard stumbled back, the bat flying from his hands. He stared at the mailbox, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He ran his hand over the steel, searching for a dent, a scratch, anything. There was nothing. The surface was as smooth and unblemished as the face of a new car. Greg, the lieutenant, picked up the bat and swung with all his might. The clang was even louder this time, a punishing, unforgiving sound. Greg howled in pain, shaking his hand, the bat now a useless, vibrating stick in his grip. The mailbox stood silent and unmoving, a dark monument to Mark's defiance. Richard stared at it, his face turning a furious shade of red. He looked at the golf cart, at the useless bat, at the impenetrable mailbox. His eyes narrowed, and he glared in the general direction of Mark's house. The silent challenge was now an open war. Mark hadn't just built a mailbox they couldn't touch. He had built a symbol of his refusal to break. And Richard knew, as he climbed back into his golf cart, that this was just the beginning. The battle of the mailbox was over. The war for the neighborhood had just begun.